The House That Whispers at Midnight. When the Campos family moved to an old colonial house in a small town in the interior, they believed they had finally found a refuge to start over. The house was spacious, with its large rooms and windows that let sunlight flood every corner. The mother, Laura, was delighted with the place. It seemed to be the perfect setting to raise their two daughters, Clara and Isabella. Little did they know, however, that refuge held something far beyond the worn-out walls and unkempt garden. The first night was peaceful, but on the second, something happened. Clara, the youngest daughter, woke up in the middle of the night. Still drowsy, she heard a soft murmur, like the sound of someone whispering her name. Tiwe. The voice seemed to come from inside the walls. She then called for her parents, but the whispers stopped as soon as Laura arrived in the room. "It must have been a nightmare, my love. Go back to sleep," said the mother, arranging the blanket around the girl. The next night, Clara heard it again. This time, the voice whispered words she couldn't understand, a continuous whisper, almost like a song. The parents began to think that their daughter was having difficulty adapting to her new home, but Clara insisted, "Someone is here. I know." Days passed, and the whispers continued, growing more intense each night. Clara began to have deep, dark circles under her eyes, and Laura noticed that the girl spoke less and less. Isabella, the eldest daughter, also began to notice strange things. Footsteps upstairs when everyone was in the living room, doors that opened by themselves, a strange musty smell that came from the basement, even though it was always locked. One night, Clara appeared in her parents' room pale, shaking from head to toe. "They want to take me," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "They said I shouldn't be here." Laura felt a chill run down her spine, but her father, Marcos, decided to investigate. He checked every corner of the house that morning, convinced he wouldn't find anything. And really, there was no one. At least, no one he could see. But the situation escalated when one morning, the family woke up to find the word "Get Out" written in charcoal on Clara's bedroom wall. The handwriting was childish, but shaky, as if the hand that wrote it was not steady. Clara swore it wasn't her, and it was then that Marcos decided to install cameras around the house. Maybe, he thought, someone was breaking into the place. The cameras were installed, and the family continued with their routine. That night, however, things took a frightening turn. Around 3 in the morning, the whispers started again, but this time, they came from every corner of the house. Clara started screaming, saying she saw shadows moving along the walls, while Isabella felt a suffocating presence in the hallway, as if someone was watching her. Laura and Marcos ran to their rooms, but the girls were alone, or at least it seemed like it. The next day, Marcos reviewed the footage. What he saw left him speechless. In one of them, in Clara's room, a dark shadow appeared next to the girl's bed. It had no defined shape, but it seemed to lean over her while whispering something inaudible. In another recording, in the living room, a figure quickly passed the camera, heading towards the basement that was always locked. That same night, Marcos decided to enter the basement, determined to find out what was happening. When he unlocked the door, a putrid smell filled the air, like something that had been rotting for a long time. He walked down the creaking steps, and when he reached the bottom, he saw something that made him instinctively step back. In the darkest corner, there was a little old cloth doll, with its eyes sewn shut and its mouth closed with red lines. Next to her, an old sepia photograph of an unknown girl who had an expression of deep sadness. Marcos took the doll with shaking hands and felt a wave of cold cross the cellar. And then he listened. A whisper, almost imperceptible, echoed around him. "She wants to leave. Let her out." The enigma of the missing passenger. It was a rainy and lonely night. Charles was returning home after a long business trip. The narrow road wound through an isolated region surrounded by dense forests. The sky seemed to dissolve into water, and the car's headlights were the only thing illuminating the dark, endless path. The only company he had was the rhythmic sound of windshield wipers and the distant roar of thunder. As Carlos drove along the deserted road, he saw a figure standing on the side of the road in the pouring rain. It was a man, his face obscured by the hood of his coat, raising his thumb, asking for a ride. Carlos' initial impulse was to accelerate and ignore the unknown, but something made him brake and move the car back. On a night like this, no one should be at the mercy of the storm, he thought. The man quickly got into the car, closing the door with a thud. "Thanks, friend. I thought I'd be soaked to the skin," he said, in a husky but friendly tone of voice. Carlos smiled, although an inexplicable shiver ran up his spine. "No problem. Where are you going?" "To the next village," the stranger replied, vaguely. Carlos found the answer strange, but he didn't want to seem rude. The journey continued in silence for a few minutes, with the sound of rain echoing over the car. Then the passenger started talking. "Do you know the story of that curve we passed just now?" asked the man, breaking the heavy silence. "They say that it was there that a tragic accident happened, about 20 years ago. A car lost control and plunged into the embankment. The driver died instantly." Carlos felt butterflies in his stomach, but he tried to appear uninterested. "Really? I didn't know that," he replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. "What exactly happened?" "They say the driver was running away from something, or someone," the passenger continued. "The car rolled over several times before stopping. When rescuers arrived, they found the driver's body, but there was another mystery. In the passenger seat, there was only a folded coat. It was never known if he was alone that night or if the other person managed to escape." Carlos shifted uncomfortably in the seat. Something about the stranger's voice was unsettling, a cold lilt that seemed to penetrate his mind. "And why didn't anyone know anything else?" he asked, more to keep the conversation going than out of real curiosity. "The curious thing," continued the man in a lower tone, "is that some people who pass by here say they saw a man hitchhiking, on exactly the same curve, always on rainy nights, like this one. They say that, after picking him up on the road, he mysteriously disappears before they reach their destination." Carlos laughed nervously. "Are you saying I caught a ghost now?" He cast a quick glance at the passenger, trying to ease the tension, but what he saw chilled him to the bone. The seat next to it was empty. The stranger was no longer there. Carlos hit the brakes hard, causing the car to skid on the wet asphalt until it stopped on the shoulder. His heart was beating fast in his chest, and he looked around desperately. The rain continued to fall, heavily, and there was no sign of anyone. The seat where the passenger had been sitting just a few seconds ago now looked as if it had never been occupied. The raindrops on the window were the only silent witnesses. Trembling, Carlos remembered the man's words. Always on rainy nights. He disappears before they reach their destination. Not knowing what else to do, he sped off again, this time without looking back, with the growing feeling that he had somehow crossed an invisible line on that road. The photography that captured the soul. Roberto was a photographer by profession and by heart. His work led him to explore forgotten places and lost objects, searching for images that told stories of times long gone. It was during one of these searches that he found an antique store hidden in the city center. It was a small, dark place where the smell of old wood and dust dominated the air. On the crowded shelves, there was everything: old clocks, rusty music boxes, and among the trinkets, a very old-looking camera caught his attention. She appeared intact, with a sturdy metal body and a tarnished gold emblem that read, Lux Eterna. The store owner, an elderly man with cloudy eyes and a trembling voice, approached. "A fine choice, young man," he said, "but be careful with it. They say this camera captures more than just the image." Roberto laughed softly, without paying much attention to the warning. He bought the camera and left the store, eager to use it on his adventures. That night, he decided to test it in his studio. The camera seemed to work perfectly, although the shutter click had a different sound, almost like a muffled sigh. He took some photos of random objects, an old chair, a vase of wilted flowers, and finally a photo of himself. The first rolls of film were developed without any major surprises, until he began to notice something strange. In each image, there were shadows he didn't remember seeing. In the photo of the chair, a dark silhouette appeared to be sitting on it. In the vase, an indistinct hand seemed to reach for the flowers. But the most disturbing photo was the self-portrait. In the background, there was an indistinct figure with an almost human shape, but blurred, as if it was fading away at the moment the image was captured. Intrigued and a little scared, Roberto tried to ignore what he had seen and continued photographing with the camera in different locations: empty parks, deserted streets, and even at some events. But with each film development, the shadows became clearer, more present. Faces began to appear, distorted and shadowy, and he was sure they were different in each photo. Things took an even darker turn when people he photographed began to disappear. First, it was a friend, Daniel, who posed for some photos in a park. The next day, he didn't show up for work, nor was he seen by anyone. A few days later, it was the turn of a professional colleague. There was a disturbing pattern. Everyone he photographed with the camera disappeared without a trace. And in the photographs he developed, the shadows became clearer, more alive. Desperate, Roberto returned to the antique store, but to his surprise, the place was empty, as if it had been abandoned decades ago. The shelves were covered in dust, and there was no sign of the owner or any of the merchandise he had seen before. It was as if the store had never existed. Roberto decided to stop using the camera, but something inside him seemed to pull him back to it. One night, while he was in his studio, a strange feeling came over him. It was as if the environment around him was colder, darker, and then he heard a faint whisper that seemed to come from inside the camera. "Release us." He didn't know what that meant, but panic took over him. He took the camera and decided to destroy it. He ran into the yard, throwing it hard on the ground and stomping on it until it broke into pieces. But the moment the camera shattered, a wave of cold swept through the air, and he felt a presence behind him. He turned around and saw, for just an instant, all the shadows and figures that appeared in the photos. They surrounded him, and their faces showed an expression of relief and anger all at the same time. And then, in the next instant, everything disappeared. The camera was destroyed, but something inside Roberto had changed forever. The next morning, he found one last photo on the floor of his studio. It was an image of him, standing in the backyard, surrounded by all these shadowy figures. And behind it, an inscription that wasn't there before: "Now you are also part of the image." The Forest of the Last Goodbye. It was supposed to be just another adventure between friends. Lucas, Mariana, Pedro, and Julia decided to camp in a forest known for the dark legends that surrounded the region. The place was isolated, and it was said that anyone who entered the forest after sunset never came back the same. But for the group, these stories were nothing more than superstition. They just wanted a weekend away from the city, lighting a fire, telling scary stories, and enjoying nature. When they arrived at the place, they soon noticed something different in the atmosphere. The air seemed thicker. The wind whistled through the trees as if whispering ancient secrets. The shadows formed by the evening lengthened in a strange way, distorting the surrounding landscape. Pedro, the bravest of the group, laughed and commented that the place had the perfect look for a horror film. They set up camp near a clearing and lit a fire, and soon they were laughing, sharing stories, and roasting marshmallows. It was then that Mariana mentioned one of the local legends. "Have you ever heard of the Last Goodbye Trail?" she asked, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "They say that in the past, families would bring their sick or injured loved ones here, hoping that the forest spirits would heal them. But more often than not, they would end up disappearing. It was as if the forest demanded something in return." Lucas laughed nervously. "So if someone gets hurt here, they'll be taken away by the spirits?" he said, trying to divert the conversation to something less uncomfortable. But before anyone could respond, a shrill scream echoed through the forest, so loud it made everyone's heart skip a beat. Julia jumped up, looking around. "What was that? An animal?" he asked, his voice shaking. The group remained silent, listening only to the sound of the forest, which now seemed suffocatingly quiet. Pedro, always the bravest, took a flashlight and decided to investigate. "I'll take a look. It's probably just some stray animal," he said, as he walked away from the camp. Mariana wanted to accompany him, but he stopped her. "Stay here, I'll be back in a minute." Minutes passed, and Pedro didn't return. The silence around them seemed increasingly heavy, as if something was watching them. Lucas decided that they had waited long enough and, with the flashlight in hand, decided to go after his friend. Mariana and Julia followed him, even against their will. They walked along the trail, calling out to Pedro. But all they heard was the echo of their own voices. That's when they saw something shining in the distance, between the trees. They approached cautiously, and as they got closer, they realized that it was Pedro's lantern, lying on the ground. But there was no sign of him. Just a trail of footprints that disappeared into a dense fog that formed further ahead. They continued following the trail, their hearts racing and the growing feeling that they were being watched. The fog seemed to move, forming distorted, almost human shapes. Then, Mariana saw something that made her scream. Ahead among the trees was a pale figure who stared at them with empty eyes. It was Pedro, or at least something that looked like him. His face was distorted as if something had sucked the life out of him. He mumbled disjointed words, repeating over and over, "I said goodbye, I said goodbye." Lucas tried to get closer, but as soon as he took a step, Pedro disappeared into the fog as if he had never been there. The surrounding forest began to move, the sound of whispers and low laughter echoing through the trees. The three ran back to camp, but when they arrived, something was wrong. The fire was out, and the place looked different, as if it had been abandoned years ago. Desperate, they tried to find their way back, but everything around them seemed to change. The trail they followed before now split into multiple directions. The clearing, where they had set up the tents, was no longer there. The forest surrounded them, and each path they chose took them deeper, like a maze with no exit. Mariana fell to her knees, crying. It was then that Lucas noticed an inscription carved into one of the trees in a familiar handwriting, "Last Goodbye, 1996. And right below there were 4 names written in the same handwriting: Pedro, Lucas, Mariana, and Julia. Reality hit them like a punch. The trail of the last goodbye was not just a legend, and the price for getting out of it had already been charged. Until next time.